Hey everyone, I'm Laura from the Y Safeguarding, formerly NSU, and I'm here with Brent today to talk about people, which is actually the first element under the operations chapter, so very exciting. We are going to do this section in two parts. So the first part is going to be more for HR managers and also people and culture teams, which is regarding recruitment and the vetting process. And then the second part will be more for managers, talking about onboarding and retention as well. So Brent, tell me broadly, what does people mean in the safeguarding framework?
All right, so for part one, for this video alone, people, what we're talking about is, as you said, recruitment and vetting. So we're making sure that our HR managers are empowered because they're essentially the gatekeepers. They're making sure that we're finding suitable candidates and we're giving them the opportunities that they deserve.
And when we talk about recruiting, that's really like right back at the start when we advertise the role, yeah?
That's right, yeah.
So what can we do for safeguarding when we're doing that, when we're advertising the role?
So first step is always to pretty much set out clear expectations in the role advertisement itself. So when you actually, I guess, you're giving that call to action for somebody, a prospective applicant to respond to, they know at the Y we take safeguarding very seriously.
And that can act as a deterrent for the wrong people as well, can't it? Yeah. Awesome. And then what would be next after advertising the role? What would we be looking at when we're, I guess, recruiting the right people to come work for us at the Y?
Good shout there, Laura. Thank you very much. So within the larger guidance document, we've got some really good tips and tricks about identifying red flags within the recruitment process. Because what comes next after the initial advertisement is obviously processing our applications. So that might be looking through their professional experience, obviously requesting proof of their academic history as well, if that's required, whether they've gone to sort of TAFE or universities, if that's required for the role. And identifying things that sort of might just look or feel a little bit, I guess, concerning when you're considering them as a candidate.
And does that mean they're automatically a write-off, or does that mean there's just some things maybe we should look into or be curious about?
No, so it's not necessarily that they're a write-off. I mean, it really does depend, obviously, on what those red flags are. And in some instances, we do owe the courtesy of actually following up those red flags. We don't want to summarily sort of, invalidate someone's application. It's about making sure that before we make any of those sort of rash decisions, that we're asking the right questions. But that's a really good segue into the next section, which is obviously about vetting. So that's making sure that, if we've actually got a staff member or an applicant that we think looks really promising, our next port of call is actually to vet them. And that means that we're looking for a working with children check, a working with vulnerable people check, or a blue card, whatever it is in your state or territory, that will actually provide us more relevant information about whether they're eligible to work in a child-related role. Have they had any history of actually any offences that relate to children and young people? And then on top of that, we also consider police checks, which is not just child-related offences, that's obviously every type of offence. Now, from a safeguarding perspective, that obviously means that it's not as relevant as the working with children check, but we certainly need to see all of these things together because they start to paint that bigger picture on whether we actually want to, take the risk of inviting that staff member or that volunteer to look after our children and young people.
And we do get questions sometimes around those checks. Is it really necessary, especially in the volunteer space? We're trying to, reduce barriers and get people to do things. But what would be your answer, I suppose, to that when we do get a bit of pushback regarding these checks?
I'll tell you the easiest way to respond to that. Okay, so most state and territory governments have got two tiers. Now, I've got a point, I'll lead to it in a second. I've got two tiers. So you can either pay a lot more money for an employee check or for a volunteer check. Now, that says to me the government has considered that it's necessary for volunteers. Otherwise, they'd have one tier only for staff. And I have not worked in those areas, so I can tell you I'm happy to trust their expertise. So yes, we want, obviously, everyone to be involved with the community. We want the Y to take a large part in the community. But it's not a risk that we can take, especially in some states, the volunteer check is free. So, if you're sort of unsure about what your volunteer checks will require in your state or territory, just make sure you're looking up the right child protection agency, whether it's Services New South Wales or anything like that. They'll have more information about whether you're eligible, but we won't take that risk.
No, that's really fair. And as you said with the police check, it's not necessarily just safeguarding or child-related offences. It can be other things as well, like fraud, IT risk and all that kind of stuff as well. So I guess just to wrap up, what would you recommend if you do get an adverse check or you do have something come back? What would be the next steps for our frontline staff?
All right, so we need to, I'm going to keep saying this, but it's the risk assessment of it all, okay? So if, for example, they've had a speeding fine, and no child was harmed, as determined by the police who might have investigated that speeding offence, we could still hire them. Okay, because that offence had nothing to do with protecting children and young people within the YMCA. If, for example, they've actually offended against a child or a young person, vetoed. Unfortunately, we cannot give them the opportunity, and I'm sure that makes sense to anybody who's watching today. If you're talking about any of the larger checks, it's just a risk assessment side, and we have built that into a lot of our processes. So if, for example, someone hasn't been able to obtain their working with children check immediately prior to them needing to be recruited, because we do have a lot of emergency recruitment for the ratios in childcare, for example, then we just make sure that they're supervised. All right. But if it were a police check, for example, and we've got it right in front of us and it's an adverse check, we're probably looking about whether it's worth hiring that person.
Sure. Okay. And so we've got to the point now that we perhaps have the right candidates and we're ready to interview. What kind of safeguarding tips can you give when doing the interview process?
Yep, so once again, it's all about checking our safeguarding guidance document because the red flags and the hot tips are actually really good information when you go into these things. What we can sort of suggest is that you must actually undertake those interviews face-to-face, so whether that's like we're doing now or actually online, but that's because you can actually have that more intuitive, I guess, reflection on their responses. And if anything sounds a bit inconsistent, there might be a little bit more of those red flags. So it's about making, obviously we can't always trust our intuition, otherwise we wouldn't have procedures and processes in place, but it's just about trying to make that connection and see what their history entails and whether there's any vulnerabilities in that.
Yep. Okay. And then if we like the person and we want to try and hire them, what would be your advice regarding reference checks as well?
Yep, much the same. Although we can't usually hold them face to face, it is better to at least do it on the phone. We are taking that little bit step back because we don't want to inconvenience them, but over the phone you can at least hear any changes in the voice that would sort of, I guess, make us think that do we need to get an alternative reference, for example. And the good thing is as well, within the guidance document, we've actually got some questions that you can use for your interviews and your reference checks, and they actually try and fill some of those gaps.
Yeah.
All right,
good guide on how to do that and support people through that as well, isn't it? Yep. Awesome. That's a big chapter, so that's just part one.
Yep. Now, we will say before we move on though, before we forget, if you're ever stuck on anything, it's obviously give us a yell at safe@ymca.org.au, but otherwise, we can see them for part two.
Yeah. Thanks, Brent.